Colleagues, friends, thank you very much for joining us today at the Australian National University. I'm Rory Medcalf, the head of the National Security College, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this special event, to host this special event, which is the public session of a two-day conference on electoral integrity. As we begin, I'll acknowledge, and I know colleagues here will also acknowledge, the traditional custodians of the land where we gather today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Just a reminder to all of you that we're on the public record here, so please put your phones on silent. We have a powerhouse of speakers today, and I know that all of you, like me, want to hear every single word. In a moment, I'll be introducing our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Genevieve Bell, who will set the scene with some opening remarks welcoming you to the university. We will then hear from the Australian Electoral Commissioner, Tom Rogers. Tom and his team are very much the driving force behind this conference, and I'm incredibly pleased to count the Electoral Commission as one of the 19 institutional leaders across the Commonwealth who invest in the mission of the National Security College. We're then privileged to be joined by the Minister for Home Affairs and Cybersecurity, the Hon Clare O'Neil MP, who will give an address looking at the intersection of democratic resilience and social cohesion. And I welcome also the Secretary of the Department, Stephanie Foster. The College is pleased to partner with Home Affairs, one of our core sponsor agencies, on these and other key issues of national interest. After all of that, there'll be a panel discussion with leading experts and practitioners. You'll excuse a few of our VIPs if they need to leave at some point around about then, but we'll then have about an hour of in-depth discussion with these practitioners from policy, from academia, from think tanks, a reflection of the college's vital role as a place for a challenging contest of views and insights. And this will be moderated by Therese, Pearce, Laanela, from the Stockholm headquarters of the International Institute for Democratic and Electoral Assistance. This is a very respected intergovernmental organisation, an unsung hero of democracy, and another key partner in this week's proceedings. And I was actually quite thrilled to learn that Therese, in fact, has completed her PhD very recently at RegNet here at ANU, which also speaks volumes, I think, to the global reputation of this university in policy-relevant research. So thank you to all of our international visitors who are here, and we'll hear more about those visitors shortly, leaders in electoral management from around our region and around the world. And thank you to the other university leaders and partners of NSC who've joined us from across campus. And of course to the NSC and ANU team for their great logistical work, particularly my deputy, Dr. Carolyn Bull, who was the Sherpa for this conference, but unfortunately can't be here today. I hope these proceedings build on the work we're doing in consultations around Australia and the work that the College is doing through our recent Securing Our Future conference to try to illuminate and enrich the national conversation, particularly about why democratic institutions matter, why they're core to our interests, our values and our identity, and why they need to be cherished and defended with the world's best practice. Vice-Chancellor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory, and may I join your voice in welcoming all of you here to the Australian National University. The Laanela Nape, Algonquin, Mashantucket Pequot, Alawan and Shoshone Bannock are the countries whose names I never heard when I lived in the United States. I spent 30 years living in the US, and the country that I was on was never named and never acknowledged. And there's something remarkable for me about being back in Australia where I get to proudly call the names of the country that I'm on. So I want to acknowledge that we today are on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, to acknowledge any other First Nations people in the room, and to remind myself and all of us as I do that we're on land that was always sacred and never ceded. And that is not enough anymore to acknowledge. We have to think about what we commit to as well. At the end of last year, one of the students in my old school was doing her thesis proposal review, which is a delightful arcane ritual where you stand in front of your community and talk about what you plan to do. Congratulations, Therese, because you got through that and the rest too. Yay! And in that ritual, you talk about what you're going to do and about what work you will do. And after she acknowledged country, she said that she'd come to realise it wasn't enough to acknowledge anymore. She also had to commit. And she committed to her work being of value. And I think about that every time I make an acknowledgement in this role, about not what we acknowledge, but what we acknowledge and what we commit to. And for me, that commitment is about shepherding a national university through a difficult part and time in our history, and shepherding us through a difficult set of conversations, and being aware that what the National University is the place that should host and convene those hard and difficult conversations. I'm lucky in doing that I inherit a university that's been at the centre of having hard conversations since it was first imagined in the 1940s. For a Prime Minister in the immediate post-war period, a Labor Prime Minister at that, for Ben Chifley, he looked around the world he found in the aftermath of World War II and wondered what the nation would need. And he was clear that what the nation would need was a set of capabilities and capacities and a set of social and political actors that were of this place, that were raised here and trained here. Because in 1946, the reality was if you wanted a PhD, you went overseas. There wasn't a place to get them in Australia. And so for Chifley, he believed that creating a national university was a way of investing in the capability Australia would need to rebuild itself after World War II, and to find a place in a world that had been violently rearranged, politically, economically, socially, in a physical and material sense. And he invested in the idea that looking forward, you would need to deliberately curate the world you wanted, and that would require approaching and thinking meaningfully about a set of problems that in the 1940s seemed urgent. Issues about nuclear power and nuclear physics, issues about the Asia-Pacific region, issues about healthcare, issues about the body politic, issues about what it meant to be Australian and how we invested in our own culture. And you look back in that moment in time and think, those issues still seem to be surprisingly present in the 21st century. I think, were I talking to Chifley now, I would probably add to that list a point of view about climate change and the energy transition, a point of view about the role of new technologies in destabilising democracies and how we might want to lean into that, and a point of view too about where as the National University we should be in a conversation about reconciliation, truth and justice. And I think about the role of the National University in doing all of that. Now, Nugget Coombs, who was one of our chancellors and a hugely important person, I think, in the second half of the 21st century in Australia, of imagining who and what we could be, in reflecting on the university, said to himself and many others that he and his colleagues hoped that what they were building was a powerhouse of social reconstruction, and that what they would do was make a place that would give Australia the knowledge with which to build wisely. He lamented that then he invited academics to the party, and what he got instead was a university of quality and distinction, but one that found dealing with bureaucrats and their relentless desire for information on time and on point was unhelpful. I realise in the first half of the 21st century and a quarter into that century already, Nugget's vision of a university that was a powerhouse of social reconstruction and a university of quality and distinction are visions that shouldn't be separated. They need to be united. And I think about my responsibility as Chancellor being how we bring those things together and what it means to be a place that builds capacity for a nation in a time of violent and structural rearrangements of the world feels as acute now as it probably did in 1947. So having these conversations here in this moment feels especially important. If the university in 1947 was worried about the consequence of penicillin on the health of a nation, I worry about the consequence of AI on the health of our society. And I think about all the pressing concerns that brings. I also think about what it means to shepherd and host these conversations and reflect on my first 6 months as Vice-Chancellor, realising that in that moment we have brought a great many extraordinary people to campus, and I'm happy to add Clare O'Neil and Tom Rogers to that list. That also means, for those of you who've seen me anywhere publicly in the last little while, we're going to have to enact a very strange ritual indeed. So when I became Vice-Chancellor, I cleaned the Chancellery. Literally and figuratively. I upended many cupboards and found many things that had to be shipped into storage or sent away or, quite frankly, recycled with care. What I also was gifted in that moment was something called the Australian National University's Visitors Book. And it was in action from the 1940s to the 1980s. It was signed by all the interesting people that visited the university in that period. Much to the confusion of one of my young research assistants, it was signed Philip, 1954. She wondered if we could work out who that was because he didn't appear to have a first name or a surname depending on how you read that. It also, for me, bears the signatures of Gough and Margaret Whitlam. It bears the signature of Malcolm Fraser, who did feel the need to annotate it with Prime Minister, in case we didn't notice that. And the very last signature before it went into a cupboard in 1984 is Bob Hawke, which takes up a whole page. When I brought this book back into circulation, I set about ensuring that anyone who came on campus signed it, which means in the first couple of months it was Prime Ministers from other countries. But then I had a moment of realizing that the only women who'd signed this book before it came into my possession were people's wives and people's daughters. And part of the arc of this year has been have women sign it in their own rights. So former Prime Minister Gillard, former Prime Minister Clark, June Oscar, Padma Raman, all have graced this book with their presence. And so, Minister O'Neil, I hope you will indulge me, that you will sign it. You will sign it too, making you the first serving minister, female at that, to join our visitors book. And the reason I do that is that I think moments like this are worth marking. Bringing together conversations aren't just about the moment we have, but the way we tell the story about it later. And when I think about what it means to worry about truth and to worry about what is real and what isn't, there is something delightfully old-fashioned but also persistent in asking someone to sign their name to a document. The way, frankly, we think about signing our names when we vote and how we think about all of that. So I can't think of anyone better to shepherd the next piece of this conversation along than Tom Rogers, who is the Commissioner for the Australian Electoral Commission and who, along with me, was nerding outside about electoral politics. And so, Tom, I'll also make you sign the book, but I'm not as excited about you as Claire, I'm sorry. Come on.
It's the story of my life, Genevieve. So, Minister, Vice-Chancellor, Provost, Professor Metcalfe, electoral commissioners and senior electoral officials from around the globe and from Australia, Secretary Foster, other senior guests, colleagues and friends. A significant amount of commentary has occurred about the number of people that are going to be voting this year, and you see figures from between 2 and 4 million people internationally, with democratic elections in places as geographically dispersed as the EU, UK, Indonesia, India, Mexico, Solomon Islands, France, the United States and the United Kingdom. And I make that last comment because whilst we have some of our colleagues here, the CEO of the UK Electoral Commission was supposed to be here, but he's otherwise occupied. I also say democratic election because having an election doesn't necessarily guarantee democracy, but you can't have a democracy without one. So however, simple numbers of the conduct of elections is only one marker of global democratic health. Globally, highly charged political environments, decreased levels of trust in government institutions, and an evolving electoral threat landscape driven at least in part by breathtaking advances in technology are creating challenges for electoral management bodies that we've never previously seen. So it's for these reasons, Minister, that it's important to have you here at this public event. It's recognition that Australian elections are not only the most complex peacetime logistical event in the life of our country, but also an incredibly important part of national security. Without free, fair and hugely trusted elections, our parliaments lack the democratic legitimacy that they need to effectively govern. This underpins the stability which can often be taken for granted. There are particular challenges, Minister, that I know Parliament is looking at, and it is complex. The continued rise of mis- and disinformation, now being potentially turbocharged by the use of artificial intelligence, the continued spreading of what I think are quite unhinged conspiracy theories about the electoral processes, and increasing threats to electoral officials, and these all require urgent attention. You should be heartened, though, Minister, that in Australia, and I know for some of our overseas colleagues, electoral administrators are leading the agenda in these matters. In Australia, the establishment of our Electoral Integrity Assurance Task Force, our Defending Democracy Unit, the Reputation Management System, our groundbreaking Stop and Consider campaign, and our hugely effective use of social media and our media outreach, in addition to the establishment of a disinformation register, are all helping to maintain citizen trust. But we know more can be done, and all the electoral administrators in this room look forward to working with legislators to make that occur as we move forward. Rest assured that over these 2 days, just point out the 2 days are actually the culmination of a long period of virtual seminars that we've been holding with administrators from around the world. We will be sharing our experiences, ideas and solutions to ensure that as administrators we're doing as much as we can to help solve some of these rapidly changing and very complex problems that we're dealing with. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce the Minister for Home Affairs and for Cybersecurity, the Honourable Clare O'Neil. I should say as Commissioner, we should also do the democratic thing, also the member for Hotham, first elected in 2013, who's had a number of public and private sector and elected roles, including earlier on Mayor of the City of Greater Dandenong. And Minister, thank you very much for wearing purple, which is the AUC's colour. You've gone the extra mile, and we've never had a minister do that before, and we're very appreciative. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, and thanks for the props on my outfit. I really appreciate that. We obviously talked earlier in a very appropriate manner. I want to just join Genevieve. What a beautiful acknowledgement of country that you gave us there, and really important to just contrast and think about the efforts we're making towards reconciliation and the hard work that a lot of Australians are doing of First Nations heritage and otherwise to try to move this issue forward. And in that spirit, I join you in acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who have been traditional custodians of Canberra now for 50,000 years. A lot of people would have heard before that Canberra is a traditional place of our First Nations people of really important conversation. And ANU is built on this very sacred land in that respect. And the work that Genevieve, you're doing, that Brian Schmidt did before you, is building an institution that's of fundamental importance to the work we do up on the Hill. I want to thank Tom and the Australian Electoral Commission. It's so great to be here with you. And I want to acknowledge Steph Foster, the wonderful secretary of my department. I know you're all aware of this, but Steph is driving some incredibly important change in the Home Affairs Department at the moment, and she's just doing a wonderful job, something we're working very hard on together. And I want to acknowledge all of you as well. I did not fully appreciate the room full of peak democracy nerds that I would be with today in this room, and I just feel so at home. Like, this is absolutely my natural environment. I'm a politician, so I absolutely love elections. And I know a lot of Australians don't share that view with me, and I completely get why. But to me, and I think to most of us here, it borders on simply heavenly to seeing the citizens of our country talking and thinking about the issues that matter to their lives, holding their politicians to account, making real choices about the direction of our country and the people they want to see lead us in that direction, and doing so peacefully at the ballot box. Election days are extra special too in my neck of the woods. Hotham, as Tom mentioned, is one of the most truly multicultural parts of our country. There's around 100 odd countries of origin represented in my local area. And so the streets of my electorate absolutely pulse with the life and diversity of all of these different people who come from all of these different cultures. Thousands of the people that I represent in federal parliament come from countries where fascism, nepotism, corruption, violence and oppression are part of their everyday experience of being governed. So for many people that I represent, they don't resent going to the vote. They don't represent the ballot box when they need to go to it. Every election day, I get this unbelievable privilege of meeting new Australian citizens who are voting in their first time in their lives. And usually when I meet these people, they cannot wipe the smile off their faces. Some of them will bring their whole family with them, and the family will dress up beautifully to commemorate this amazing experience in the life of their journey. They know what it means to not have the choices that those of us who are Australian born in this room mostly take for granted. And now they get to live in one of the most successful democracies in the entire world. So they know better than you and me that democracy isn't an inevitability. It is not a natural state of order. The simple act of going to vote for our leaders is something that most of the world's population do not get access to. And for those of us that live in a full democracy like Australia, that's even more rare. Just 8% of the world's population live in countries that we could describe as a full democracy. Australia's democracy in particular is very special and very unique. We are the 6th oldest democracy in the world. Most Australians would have no idea about that. And we were pioneers in so many ways, pioneers in giving women the right to vote, and the very first in the world to extend women with the opportunity to run for Parliament. What an enormous source of pride that is for me. We are amongst a fairly small number with compulsory voting. We're pioneers in the secret ballot, in preferential voting, and we're pioneers because South Australia was the very first place in the world to have a permanent independent electoral commission. And from that pioneering move, we have created one of the world's most finest, non-partisan, professional electoral administrations, devoid of political interference, that we see today exemplified in the modern Australian Electoral Commission. We've made mistakes in our democracy too, and we've been able to correct them, notably the early and prolonged disenfranchisement of First Nations people. So our democracy is successful in part because it lives and it breathes. Our democracy matters, it is precious, and it is something that every Australian needs to understand and feel that sense of pride that you and I do in. Now, when I look at the decades ahead, we have got some really significant challenges on the horizon. And I've said before, if I could be any country in the world facing into what the coming decades have for us, whether it's climate change, whether it's geopolitical tension or other issues, I would pick Australia every single day of the week. But the decades ahead are going to be more precarious. Our government has said we face into the most difficult geostrategic circumstances that Australia has confronted since the end of the Second World War. That's a pretty big deal. So it means that the choices we make in the coming decades are going to carry heavier consequences, and I think we can afford to make fewer errors than we have in the past. Our best asset going into this critical period is the quality and tone of our democracy. And I want to talk to you today about two things that I'm concerned about in terms of trying to erode and disrupt the success of that democracy. The first is about the immense damage that social media today is having on our political system. And the second is related. It's about social cohesion and how tears in our social fabric are starting to normalise fundamentally anti-democratic behaviour, and we have to stand up and call that out. Social media came of age at a moment that most people would look back on and think of as technological utopianism. We saw this new technology. At worst, it looked like something fairly innocuous, a way we might use to look up our high school friends and see what they were up to. At best, we saw a profound new way for people around the world to make meaningful human connections. But what we've seen instead is something quite the opposite. What we've seen instead is a large-scale tool which is driving polarisation and entrenching binary views and values that we see all the time today in the way that Australian politics is conducted. Misinformation has always been a part of democratic life, but not like today. Social media allows misinformation to spread at warp speed with a scale and intensity that we've never seen before in human history. And there is plenty of evidence to show that lies spread faster and further than the truth. Democracy has always been at its heart about the constructive contest of ideas. That doesn't happen in those social media echo chambers, which are designed not to challenge and grow our human perspective and experience, but to affirm and narrow pre-existing views. Social media is degrading our democracy and dividing us at the very time when we need to be united. And it's no chance that the recent rise that we have seen all over the world in populism is correlated with the introduction of social media. What's really worrying me about this problem is that what we're seeing now, I think, is the tip of the iceberg. And Tom spoke, and Genevieve spoke a little bit earlier about generative AI and what we are going to see with a technology that we are still coming to grips with from a regulatory perspective, and how this will further turbocharge the construction and the sharing of profound misinformation. Social media is also threatening our democracy because it is probably the principal vehicle today by which our main concern as a country, our main national security concern, that is foreign interference, is being conducted. Social media platforms are allowing malign actors who seek to do Australia harm to gather pretty detailed intelligence about the citizens of our country so that they can be targeted, and those same actors are then using social media platforms to promote malicious narratives that undermine trust in our leaders, institutions, and fellow Australians. These social media companies and digital platforms, they're not an organic development. They're not a natural extension of the way that you and I as human beings conduct public discourse. They are products and platforms developed and operated by private companies that have, in essence, sacrificed the health of our democracy at the altar of profit. By impeding our access to the truth, by polluting our society with harmful content, by assisting foreign agents to interfere in our precious democracy, and by weaponising our baser instincts, social media is a genuine and growing threat to our democracy, and that makes it a genuine and growing threat to Australia's national security. The second challenge I want to speak to you about is the deterioration of social cohesion. Now, of course, these two problems are interconnected. I talked to you about the beautiful diversity that I see in my electorate of Hotham, and if we are looking for success stories of social cohesion in modern Australia, I would love for you to come to my electorate in southeast Melbourne, because on every single street in my suburb there are dozens of beautiful stories of people who come from countries all over the world and share and focus on their common unity. Dozens in every street and hundreds in every local school. This sort of social cohesion is essential to the success of our country. It's essential to our way of life as Australians. It underpins our well-being, our trust in others, and our confidence in our public institutions. The more connected Australians feel to their shared citizenship, to their own country and to each other, the safer we will be and the better quality our democracy will be. But across Australia, those metrics of connection and of unity, we can see that they are in decline. They're actually in long-term decline, but particularly steep decline in recent years. A key indicator has been the increase in Australians reporting experiences of prejudice based on their ethnicity, religion and migrant status in recent years, and that trend has really, really hotted up in recent months as the conflict has started in the Middle East. I think for those of us who don't come from a diverse background, we cannot truly appreciate how pervasive Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are in our country today. A lot of you in this room probably have the beautiful experience that I do of being able to speak to people who come from different cultural backgrounds, and so you will know this to be true. Discrimination is a pervasive part of life for people who are visibly religious in our country today, especially from these two religious backgrounds. The Executive Council of Australian Jewry noted a 41.9% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in Australia between October 2022 and 30 September 2022. And then between 7 October, when the conflict began, and December 2023, there was a 738% increase in anti-Semitic incidents. This is real. It's really happening to people in our community. When I look at the stats around the Islamophobia incidents in Australia, the Islamophobia Register found that there was a 13-fold increase in Islamophobic attacks in just the 7 weeks following the October 7 attacks in Israel. Now, there's absolutely no question that these filter bubbles and echo chambers of social media that I talked about, powered by these opaque algorithms, are germinating and growing bigotry in our country, and we need to fight back. They are not just straining the social fabric, they are ripping at it continuously and aggressively. I've spent, as you would hope and expect, a lot of time with my communities talking to them about what their experience is and how this feels to be discriminated against in one of the most beautiful democracies and the most beautiful diverse countries in the world. And the stories are very jarring and very shocking. For Anglo-Australians, most of us can't imagine being racially abused or spat on a train. But this is not an uncommon experience for women in our country who wear a hijab every day. And when I talk to Jewish Australian citizens who I represent, they tell me that this is the most fearful time they've ever experienced living in our country. They say that they feel genuinely scared when they drop their children off at childcare every day. Now, there are very strong beliefs about the conflict in the Middle East, but I see this as a test case for how a country like ours can manage a difficult issue where lots of people in our country will have strong and different beliefs about something. I support people's right to express their views about the conflict in the Middle East and any other matters that they care about. The right to protest is a basic right in Australia, and it is a fundamental part of our democracy. But when we see protests that engage in violence which alienate vulnerable members of our society from services and representatives, we have to push back. The right to protest is not a blank cheque for behaviour that threatens social cohesion in our country. And I think it's really important for us all to understand what's at stake here. It's nothing less than the social cohesion of our community and the success or failure of one of the strongest and oldest democracies in the world. Now, what lies at the heart of these two critical things of the success of our community and the success of our democracy is mutual respect and civility. And once we lose these things, they are very, very, very hard to regain. What I see is that every time communities like ours engage in conflict of any sort, we're setting norms and standards for public debate. These are norms and standards for what we do, for how we express our views, for the words we use, for what we accuse each other of. And these norms and standards really matter. We've got a lot of democracy experts in this room, and I'm sure all of them will share this view. Democracy is about institutions, it's about good laws, it's about strong people who stand up and defend the democracy. It's also just about culture, about how we resolve conflict. Now, usually in Australia, we play out our differences about political issues in a way that respects the safety and right of other people to hold a different opinion, and I see that every day in my work as a Member of Parliament. But the most important cornerstone view of all is that we resolve these differences peacefully and at the ballot box. When I see some of the activity that's going on today, preventing vulnerable people from accessing government services, that's not respectful of our fellow citizens. Jamming open the door of the offices of politicians and screaming so that our staff have to leave, shaking with fear. These are not democratic ways of expressing belief. Painting blood red symbols of terrorism, leaving childlike fake bodies outside the offices of elected representatives. These are not properly peaceful protests. They are menacing, they are violent, and they are unacceptable. We need to remember that when we're setting these standards, whatever our views are, we are setting new norms, and one day the shoe is going to be on the other foot. And we are going to want to stand up and we're going to want to call out standards and behaviours that are acceptable when people on the other side are prosecuting in the ways that we don't like, and that's got to be remembered. I've spoken a bit about my community, and one of the things that I want you to know is that I represent a lot of people in Parliament who know what it looks like not to resolve your differences at the ballot box. In some countries of origin, for people I represent, violence and civil unrest, that culturally is how things are done, and thousands of people are living in my community right now because they fled those regimes to come to Australia because that's not how we do things. So that's what we're playing with here. In my view, it's incredibly serious, and why leaders like the people in this room need to stand up, need to talk about what's acceptable, and most of all, need to take action. So let me speak a little bit about what our government is doing about some of these very, very deep and serious issues that we're confronting. I want to first call out the Electoral Integrity Assurance Task Force, which Tom spoke a little bit off the top there. Probably for most of us in this room engaged in this area of work, we're a little bit familiar with the work Tom does at the Electoral Commission. I don't think most Australians would have any real notion, Tom, that your organisation is not just doing the nuts and bolts of how we get polls out the door and run elections, but you're actually really deeply involved in this conversation about making sure that some of what we've seen in other countries around the world where technology has been used to interfere with the electoral process is a no-go zone for us here in Australia. So I want to really just note how forward-leaning the AEC has been on particularly those issues where new technologies are becoming really prevalent, and Tom, I think your work's really, really commendable on that. The politicians on the Hill, of course, we're doing some really important things about this set of issues as well. The Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, is at the moment legislating powers for the Australian Communications and Media Authority to enable them to hold digital platforms to account for the first time for the spread of mis and disinformation. And this is a really important move because we are moving away from a world where providers of these big digital services can pretend that they have no responsibilities for the content that's on their platform. That is not a viable position going forward, and we need to start to build rules around how these companies engage that make them take responsibility. Ministers Rowland and Minister Stephen Jones have also led work to establish a really significant inquiry into how we're going to make social media companies more accountable and transparent. The Attorney-General is drafting new hate speech laws which will impose criminal penalties for serious instances of vilification because of a person's race, sexuality, gender, disability or religion, and this is in addition to those laws you're probably aware of that passed last year, which criminalised the Nazi salute and the public display and trade in Nazi hate symbols, something I'm sure most of us never thought we'd have to do in the Australian context. And we're doing some really important things in Home Affairs as well, some work that Jenny Whelan down the front here is leading within our department. So inside Home Affairs, when we were elected to government, we set up a new unit called the Strengthening Democracy and Social Cohesion Task Force. And this is really focused on a very important question, which is, I've said before, the issues facing our democracy in some respects are much admired problems. There's a lot of articles, probably into the millions of pages, of ways in which we describe what's going wrong with democracy around the world, not as much focus on the solutions. And Jenny and her team have been doing a huge amount of work thinking about what practical, concrete steps we can engage with to get active participation and build those ingredients to successful democracy that we know are really important. And I'll be launching Jenny's work a little bit later this year, and I'm really excited about the work that's been done. Something else that the department's very focused on is some of the social cohesion issues that I talked about before. We've done a lot around grant announcements and about supporting communities who are in genuinely very deep distress about what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. And the work that's been done there is really, really important as well. One thing I just want to leave you with is, I'm a politician and I've been involved in politics almost my whole life. And one of the reflexes I do notice in our dialogue about challenges that we face is that there's a lot of discussion and almost a reflex towards programs and laws. How can we change? What can we do? We're going to set up a program, we're going to change a law. And these things are all really, really important. But something I'm always reminded of when I talk to my voters is actually the most important things our politicians can do is think really carefully about what they do and say. Sometimes the most powerful thing we have in politics is our voice. And I just want to say that I think this is a really unique moment for our country, a really important one. And what we need is national leaders whose natural instinct is to bring people together. My honest view is that we have that in our Prime Minister today, and I think we've got the right person leading our country, taking us into what is some very difficult territory. I really want to thank all of you for being here today and just engaging in this conversation. I hope you can see and feel my genuine passion for the work that you do. We've got electoral commissioners here from all over the world. What an amazing thing for us here in Australia to host you and to hear your ideas about how you're confronting and dealing with some of these topics. So it's really nice to be here with you today. I really want to thank you all for your time and attention, and most importantly for the leadership you're showing in solving one of the most important things and challenges we face as a country. Thanks everyone.
Minister, thank you. That was powerful. That was very substantial. I think you've left us with a lot more than food for thought. I think you've left us all with homework, and I think that sense of commitment to democratic integrity. So thank you. That ends the the pre-panel part of our event. I want to, before we move to the panel, and I think invite Therese to moderate. Thank again the leaders from the policy community, the security community, the electoral community, and the university who've joined us today. Vice Chancellor, thank you. Also Secretary Foster, and our new Provost today, and you, Professor Rebecca Brown, as well. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll just now take please stay in place, but we'll now allow our VIP party to leave if they wish, and I'll invite Therese to moderate our expert panel. Thank you.
So we're here at the ANU. For those of you who are from abroad, I think you've seen that the dynamism and the kind of conversation that happens, it happens here in this very place and in this very building. And so we've got, I see we've got public servants, and these are the ones who, how's this? Stop jumping around. Really, really dedicated. We've got the gorgeous staff of the Australian Electoral Commission. I can see a crowd up here. We have academics who are really, really strong in this area. And I guess in this intersection between elections, democracy, and security, that's the space that we're working in this moment. And that kind of connectivity is happening here. We also have people who work internationally, especially in the Pacific. I can see a lot of engagement in these discussions. So just welcome to all of you. And to those who are just here for the public event, we have election administrators or commissioners from across Australia and across the world. We've got from Europe, from North America, and from the Pacific here in the room today. And we are exactly in this space that was introduced by our excellent speakers just now. And what we're learning is that what election authorities are facing right now is not so much the challenges of organizing elections, because they do that really, really well, but it's navigating a changing context with a seriousness of the kind that the minister just described. These are scary times, and what election commissioners are noticing is that what used to be under the radar, kind of almost a public administration type job, is now really up front, sometimes front page, and building the capabilities and capacities to deal with that changing context is really the front lines of election administration today. And so I'm so pleased to have this panel with us now, who are at, each in their own way, at the front lines of what this changing context looks like, what it will mean for democracy, and what it may mean for elections. So please, I'm so grateful that you're all here. Mindful of time, and I'll just keep my clock here. I won't do long introductions, but I will say that we have Catherine Manstead here from the National Security College, expert in this cyber environment that we're heading into. We have Dr. Banerjee, Deputy Commissioner at the Australian Public Service Commission, and our real expert on trust in institutions. So that's key to our discussions right now. We have Justin Bassey, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and we've got Jeff Pope, Deputy Commissioner of the Australian Electoral Commissioner. And I was thinking that we could start with Justin and Catherine to talk about the changing context, if that's all right. And then if we move to you, Dr. Banerjee, to see how this relates to the trust in institutions and weave that in. And Jeff, if you could bring us to how do we deal with this in terms of building, keeping the confidence of those confidence in the electoral process itself. But I also want to make sure that I weave in questions and issues from the audience, because we have a really wise audience here today. So perhaps if I could maybe even take questions at any time. So we'll go from context, trust in institutions, and elections. But does anybody want to insert any other questions already at this point? I'm looking at you. Okay. Maybe we'll start with Catherine, and after Catherine, I'll ask again. So we can, did you have something already now? No, you're good. Okay. After Catherine, I'll ask again. So I'll keep asking in case anybody wants to introduce something into the mix. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and I love the embrace of democracy from the beginning here. Now, at risk of falling into the minister's trap of identifying the challenges and the context without going into the solutions, let me articulate very briefly what that threat landscape looks like. I'll offer maybe 3 thoughts and then 2 chases. The 3 thoughts are this: when we're looking at what that threat landscape looks like, partly it's a result of technology, and the minister really kind of starkly articulated that now our public square is not only defined by something that operates at a speed and scale unprecedented, but also is defined increasingly by commercial interests, not public interests. So we have, in some sense, a public square constructed from private sector interests, not government interests. The second issue here is a resurgence globally of authoritarianism. And we see from many foreign governments an intent and capability to influence and interfere in domestic politics, partly because they want to advantage their own interests, but partly because the inherent contest of authoritarianism versus democracy sees, in some sense, those countries having an interest in showing that democracy is chaotic. And the third piece is we spend a lot of time talking about the platforms, the how the information in a democracy is now communicated. It would be remiss of me not also to talk about the data that powers that, which gives, in some sense, malactors the ability to track, trace, and monitor and interfere at unprecedented scale, as it also creates a vulnerability for us all. But I said two chasers because that's the threat landscape. Let me offer the chasers this way. I think the so what of all of that is if you think of our democracy like an orange, a piece of fruit, instead of that hard skin being on the outside, instead of governments being able to manage what are the most pressing national security challenges of our time, it's flipped open, right? And we have that soft pith, the people who are now exposed to some of the most pressing national security challenges of our time. Now that's a step change, fundamentally different to any place we've been before, and really goes to that prescription that the Minister was talking about, that actually the levers of power to solve this are not necessarily with government, they're with the people. And the second chaser here is, as much as we can look at the threats as we must, we should also be sanguine and sober in doing that, so we don't, in admiring the problem, actually create a bigger one, which is this feeling that we live in a post-truth world where nothing can possibly ever be made good again. There are really good examples around the world of pushback against this. You might contrast, for example, what happened in Slovakia in the lead up to their election with some deep fakes versus what happened recently in the UK, where we had the spectre of a Labor mayor standing next to a Tory minister debunking a deep fake piece of audio content. So the tools are in our hands. It's not something that we can admire and just watch kind of fall away from us. It's actually, there is places to be empowered and to push back. The threat landscape, I would argue, is perhaps not as bad as we think it may be.
That's gorgeous, Catherine. And I want to bring in a few things that were mentioned this morning at the conference, and that was that we have to be perhaps a little bit careful with these words like malign or words like foreign interference or disinformation, in case those words themselves are sometimes weaponized or politicized. I just wanted to insert that idea that came from our discussions this morning. But firstly, anything from the audience that I can bring in already at this point? Otherwise, I'll turn to you, Justin, for your reflections.
Super. I can really only agree with Catherine. Just to, I suppose, expand on a couple of those themes. What we're dealing with at the moment is a two-track problem. We're dealing with greater internal issues than we have before. There's more disillusionment in society with democracy. There is a misconception that democracy is no better than other political systems. We're battling that. At the same time, we're battling, as Catherine said, external forces who are, unfortunately for us, and something we do have to be aware of, using technological advances in ways that are harmful for us, and being more adept at understanding how they can be used for those purposes. Because we are not using them for all those purposes, we tend to be late and we respond to when an adversary does identify the best way to use them. So that dual problem, exacerbated by technology. Just to give you a couple of interesting stats or views on the dual issue there, the Swedish V-Dem Institute concluded last year that the global level of democracy had fallen back to where it was in 1986, so before the fall of the Berlin Wall, what we're up against. And a real AI guru, who a number of people in the room will be aware of, Stuart Russell, he recently made an assessment, his own assessment, that Russia's 2016 interference in the US election cost them about $20 million. I mean, nothing really, but he said that today, just a few years on, 8 years on, it would actually, to do the same, would only cost them about $1,000. So that's what we're up against in terms of the technological advancement, how it can be used and for cheap, very cheaply. The issue is that we're not dealing with a level playing field. It would be nice to be able to say that, well, as a democracy, let the people read all the information and make up their own mind and go to the ballot box. But as a number of, almost all the speakers have said, including the Minister, we're not just dealing with the election day, we're dealing with the context around it, and it might very well, it's important that the AEC manages the day as well as it always does, and it's always up there with the trusted institutions, which is vital. But if there's distrust in the public before we get to ballot day, election day, then we're already in big trouble. And something that I think the Minister said was interesting, I completely agree with, that she said that one of the beauties about democracies and Australian democracies is we make mistakes and we correct them. And that is a great way of being able to do it, Catherine, instead of not just identifying the problems, but going out there and actually saying, yep, we got this wrong. The issue is, what the Minister said was that we can now, with technology, afford to make fewer mistakes. And I firmly believe that. To give you a little snapshot, soon after the World Wide Web began in the mid-90s, Bill Clinton was still president. You guys probably haven't seen it, look it up on YouTube. We were just beginning, people in the national security community, just beginning to worry about China's use of the World Wide Web. And Bill Clinton was asked, are you concerned? And his response, because it was the judgment of the community at the time, his response publicly was, it would be impossible for countries like China to control the internet. It'd be like nailing Jello to a wall. And then he actually wished China good luck. And within a few years, it became very clear that China and Russia were controlling the internet. They saw not just the challenge, but the opportunity. And then I was in the Intel community in the mid-2000s when the Arab Spring happened. And the judgment, again, just not even 10 years on from that mistake that we had realised we'd made in the late 90s, our judgment was that the Arab Spring was caused by the rise of social media, and that social media was now so anarchic that a centralised government authoritarian regime was not ever going to be able to control social media. It was the greatest thing for democratisation. We don't have to do anything with it as a government, just let it run free. And then, of course, that was around for Arab Spring, 2010-ish. Again, just a few years later, we saw what Russia in particular did leading into the US election. I think with the ministers, we have responded well to all of those things, and that's great. I think where the minister's right is, at some point, tech advancement will get so advanced and AI is the next revolution. Can we afford to make that third mistake? I'm not so sure.
Good question, and yes, thank you so much. Any questions at this point? No? Yes, Bill.
Yes, William Manning with the AU. I'm kind of wonder whether we too much emphasis on social media and not enough on mainstream media. When you think of the $750 million that Fox News had to pay in compensation to the media voting systems after the disinformation that was disseminated about the circumstances surrounding the 2020 US presidential election, and the propensity for that then to feed into social media channels for further distribution. Do we not need also to bear in mind the activities of organisations like Sky News After Dark, Fox News in the United States, with Sky News incidentally being controlled by a foreigner, Rupert Murdoch?
Do you want to respond to that before we move on?
Very quickly, I'm sure the rest of the panellists will have views as well. I agree. It's the whole ecosystem. The issue is that it's not to not worry about mainstream media, but there is an ability to still regulate. and still respond, and to still have senior people, whether it be senior bureaucrats, senior government ministers, be able to, as Catherine put, debunk, or in my view, what we have to do more and more of, pre-bunk issues, and be able to separate opinion from news reporting is vital. I take it a little bit of the reverse, though. My view is that the only way out of the problem we're heading towards is actually for the government to get closer to the mainstream media. Otherwise, we're going to have an issue where already today, if you ask, the number of surveys of people under 35, under 30, the majority of the news that they're getting is from platforms like TikTok, where there isn't regulation at all. So that's a problem. So governments, I think, an answer is actually to regain trust in media, in government, and in things like media, medical institutions. At the moment, we're allowing both internal disillusionment combined with foreign adversaries to undermine trust of all of those institutions, including the mainstream media. So my view is, yes, we have to focus on it, debunk, pre-bunk, but I think actually the answer is to actually invest more in the mainstream, firstly to enable it to survive.
I think there's good news and there's bad news about the chaos of the media environment and the social media environment when it comes to trust in institutions. The good news for institutions is that sometimes when you know that it's a little bit chaotic, if you can go to the institution's actual website to look for the actual information. So if you're hearing multiple things, that's the best case scenario from an institutional point of view. Of course, the other possibility is that your institution is the target of some kind of attack, and that your institution, the trust in your institutions, is undermined because of that landscape. So those two scenarios are both playing out in the world in different ways. And so some institutions are actually winning in a way because they're seen as the stable in all of this. So here I'll turn to you and say, how are you thinking about trust in institutions in general, and where do elections fit in particular?
Sure. No, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to join you. So I'm going to draw a little bit on the empirics of a report that was published earlier this year called Trust and Satisfaction in Australian Democracy. It was done by the Australian Public Service Commission and the Home Affairs Department, and we can provide a link through the conference organisers for you from that. But one of the really striking findings in that was, and I'm sure it's a welcome finding for this audience, that amongst the values that are seen as most important for trust in democracy are that people see that there are free and fair elections. It was in the 95th percentile, I think, in terms of a ranking of importance. So all of us that take joy in the act of voting, and the Minister, of course, talked about this, that's very reassuring. There's also then a sense that Australia is at the moment performing well on that measure. So it's both seen as important and that we are doing well. And of course, all credit to Tom, Jeff, other electoral officials from state and territory jurisdictions as well. This is seen as a very solid foundation for trust in Australian democracy. So that's a good start. I think it's, of course, by definition, a foundation for thinking about public trust in government more broadly. Unless we have free and fair elections, then in a sense, what's the point of the rest of it? But it's also, I'm interested in a few kind of push and pull conversations. It also works the other way, that a kind of broader trust in our public institutions, I think, is a really important determinant for trust in elections as well. So there is a little bit of back and forth in that it's because elections are seen predominantly as free and fair that we have more trust in public institutions than we would otherwise have. But it's also because we have trust in public institutions that, broadly speaking, people think our elections are likely to be free and fair. So my expertise is not specifically in the election field, it is in broader public institutions. And thinking about the constituent elements of what engenders trust and what doesn't. And we've been thinking a lot about the mechanics of that for the Australian Public Service. So the government has just recently passed some amendments to the Public Service Act that are helping to strengthen some of the mechanics around decision-making, around transparency, around the APS values. But as well as the mechanics, of course, we're really interested in trustworthiness as well. It's the empirics are very clear that people are looking for people to actually do what they say they're going to do. And in public services, the performance of public services matters a lot for public trust as well. So we're also, and the government is focused on putting people and business in the centre through APS reform as a means of trying to increase the performance trustworthiness as well. And this really matters. It's clear in the empirics as well that really matters. So we're doing a lot of work and a lot of thinking on those constituent elements. But I guess one of the things that I was interested to explore with this audience is it does strike me that those conversations are often quite technocratic. We think about constituent elements in an institutional design, institutional architecture sense, and even to the extent that we talk about culture, and the Minister, of course, put a focus on culture, we still think about culture in a, well, like, what are the design features of culture that we're aiming for? Like, it's still got quite a kind of a technocratic sense of building culture. And I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is, I think the empirics are clear that a lot of what's going on is identity, belief, and kind of personal faith and understanding in different ways. And I wonder if we talk enough about that. Certainly within government, I wonder if we talk enough about that. I can't say more broadly. And one of the advantages, of course, of coming to the ANU is the cross-fertilisation of ideas between different sectors. I think in government, I'm not sure that we do talk enough about the identity constituent elements of thinking about trust and how you approach that as a conversation, how you have the kind of micro sense of individual interactions really matter a lot. And what does that mean? How do you think about that both in individual instances but then in aggregate? One of the ways in which we do think about that in government, we talk about not just values at the level of the organisation, integrity values in particular. We talk about integrity being an everyday practice, and we talk about making sure that it's part of conversations at the team level, weekly, daily, and that you're really trying to engender a different spirit of conversation and a different sense of duty in public sector institutions. That's one way in which we try and bring it down. But I'm still not that convinced that we're really grappling with the essence of the issue that we're facing, and instead we're kind of proposing technocratic solutions to what is more and more a kind of identity belief conversation. And I'm interested to have that conversation with the audience.
Excellent. I'll take questions I'm looking around because it would be lovely to insert more questions. But I want to pick up on two things to prompt Jeff as we go. And one, you were talking about performance trustworthiness. Now, for most public service agencies, the people working on the ground, that's what they do. So in hospitals or teachers and so forth, that is their job, and you can instill those values that you're talking about over time. One special thing about elections is that the front-facing people are there just for that day. And so that kind of time, most professionals have both been through training and have had those kinds of codes of behavior, professional behavior instilled through, nursing school or other training programs. They have regular professional development meetings and so forth. But that's, I think, a little bit special about elections, is that you are relying on your temporary workers who are in the community and maybe experiencing those other issues that you were talking about. So I just want to add that into what might make elections a little bit different from other public service agencies. And the other is, you were talking about the identity and culture, but one thing that came up earlier this morning in our conversations is that the actual issues that have the issues where violence and elections have intersected have actually not been about the elections. The examples that we heard, and we had Chatham House rules, so I won't say who it was, but the incidents were really about residual grievances in society, about things that had nothing to do with the politics. It had things to do, just if you think of COVID and ripping off masks and that types of behaviors. And if we think back on Kenya, where a mismanaged vote count almost brought Kenya to civil war, when you dug down, it was really about land issues and things that the mismanaged vote count ignited something that was underlying. And so it wasn't just the things that are propping up are some kind of agitation that isn't just about identity, but it's about grievances that haven't been resolved, which maybe speaks to some of the issues that the Vice Chancellor brought up this morning. So I just wanted to introduce that too, is that the elections are this moment where everybody, the media and everybody's looking at the same thing at the same time, which provides this opportunity to just kind of dump in all the other things that are happening in society to the same mix. That was my sense of what's happening around the types of violence that our commissioners have been experiencing. So I just wanted to mention those two things. Before we turn to Jeff, who's going to just bring this right down to what the Australian Electoral Commission is doing, can do, and what is worried about, can I introduce any other questions as we're moving in? Just wait for the microphone. Yeah, great. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you. Caitlin Figueiredo from the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition and Democracy in Colour.
Yeah.
So we've been doing a lot of work with young people across the country, and what we're finding is their interest in safeguarding democracy for future generations and looking at an intergenerational approach is steadily declining. In terms of their identity and wanting to actively participate. And so I just want to know if there's any thoughts around looking at an intergenerational approach to this sort of issues and sort of engaging with young people more broadly, especially those in rural and remote areas who often don't have access to engaging in these processes, but who are very likely to experience more radicalisation because they don't have that level of engagement.
That is an absolutely gorgeous question, a perfect one for Jeff. But also I'd like to encourage our international commissioners here, if they want to reflect on any of these, to raise their hand, and we can pass the microphone as well, because there's a lot of really interesting international experience on this as well, a lot of knowledge in this room. But I'll let you kick off, Jeff.
Thanks, Therese. It wasn't that long ago where, to be a good election management body, you just needed to recruit a few thousand people and actually deliver an election. And I think, I started in 2013, and that was pretty much what it was like, not that long, which is not that long ago. But our election management body and the role of the election management body has fundamentally changed. It's in the last decade. You don't just have to deliver an excellent election. And that's one thing that the Australian Election Commission has always focused on, is operational excellence is absolutely paramount, and it goes to that issue of trust. But we're also now almost a professionalisation of a recruitment agency. So we need to recruit around 110 to 120,000 people in a 33-day period between the issue of the writ and polling day. And going to your point, they are our frontline workers. We need to trust them, we need to train them, we need to support them. They are wearing our brand on their sleeves. And they need to be trusted by electors through everything they do. So it's not probably widely known, but just by recruiting that many people, we actually go from an agency of around 900 people to an agency that's 2 to 3 times the size of the Commonwealth Bank in 33 days, which is, for those from overseas, is our largest bank here in Australia. So not only now recruitment experts, we're also procuring and sourcing experts. We have to rely on huge amounts of trusted partners, and underlying that emphasis on trust. You could imagine if there was some sort of a crisis at Australia Post and what the implications of that could be on the trusting of postal ballots during an election, for instance. So we have to work closely and procure carefully and widen this scope of having these trusted partners that we source, largely from the private sector. But that also is still not enough. We're now also having to become communications experts and advertising experts to cut through the noise, to cut through the disinformation, to do the pre-bunking, to do the debunking. So we're now developing skills as those communications and advertising experts, and we run probably the largest advertising campaign in Australia every time an election comes around. But that also is now not enough. We also now need to be education and engagement experts, educating the community about election processes. What does a good election look like? Giving them resilience to mis and disinformation. And then I think just in the last couple of years, over and above all of that, we are now needing to be deeply connected into the national security environment, understanding the role that we have around stability in our national security environment, and also our role in social cohesion and how critical that is. And just even now in the last couple of months, questions are being raised about, well, now what is your role about regulating cutting edge technology such as artificial intelligence? So if I just look back over 11 years, how the role of an election management body has fundamentally changed and how we now need to be so rounded in all of these areas, it's a critical challenge. And I think the Australian Electoral Commission has done a great job, as have many other electoral commissions around the world, in responding to those demands and those requirements. But I think those demands and requirements are just going to continue to grow, and they're going to grow more rapidly than what they have over the last decade.
Did you want to respond to the question on youth as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question, and I guess I'm touching on that in some respects with respect to my answer. We do our best to run the largest advertising campaign to include all Australians, irrespective of where they live. The channels that we use to get that advertising out to all far corners of the country, not just country Australia, but also remote Australia and Tiwi Islands and Cocos and Keeling Islands and etc. So it is comprehensive. It is, and it's an absolute priority for us. We are working more on expanding our education offering. So we ran about 300 education sessions right around the country in the lead up to the referendum. Many of them in Indigenous languages, many of them in foreign languages. And that is something that we'll continue to build on for elections going forward. I think the first thing we need to do with our youth is actually get them enrolled. And 90% of Australian youth are enrolled, which is fantastic when you look at a comparative analysis internationally. And that's grown by about 10% in the last couple of years. So we remain focused on getting them on the roll, getting them engaged in the democratic process, reaching out to them via every possible communication channel and educating them, I think is absolutely critical. So it's one of those areas of priority for us and will continue to be.
Could I just mention on the generational issue, there is evidence, a pretty good Financial Times report recently that talked about young women going left, and not just the centre but far left, and more young men going not just right but far right. And for me, I think it's a natural thing that we have, but the advantage we have of compulsory voting compared to so many of our democratic partners, I don't think can be overestimated. That what we see overseas, you've just seen the European parliamentary elections, or you're looking at the American elections, the people on the far left and the far right are incentivised to vote. They're wanting to either vote for or vote against something they come out. And more people in those democracies who aren't required to vote but are either centre left or centre right, are saying, I'm just staying home. Whereas in Australia, where there is a level, we shouldn't be complacent about it, but we're foundationally stronger because of the fact that everybody has to come out to vote, and you have the protection that so long as you can maintain that trust within the centre, it doesn't matter who you're voting for, you've got a little bit more of a foundation there than some of our democratic partners. But definitely a big impact is that what we're seeing, the evidence show about the younger generation, both young men and young women.
Please. Can I just add something and back to you, Caitlin, to hear your view again, I think, because there's something about doing information campaigns really well, and I think the AEC is superb, there's no doubt, right? But I guess I was picking up a little bit in your question that there is a further step from information to participation in some form, and really interested in your views about what a kind of more radical view around participation for young people might look like in this sort of space, because it does touch on the discomfort I expressed in my opening remarks, which is I feel like we're kind of getting better and better at conventional technocratic means, and yet it seems to me participation in this example is a category difference, and there's something else that we need to do if we're going to talk about participation. And I know that you've thought about it a lot, so I'd love to hear a bit more if that's okay.
I think that's a really, really good idea, because I was going to say that elections are one thing and citizens' engagement is a different thing. And I think those conversations are really coming up, is what does engagement look like, and how can you leverage technology to take advantage of all the ways that engagement can happen. And I just want to add one thing interestingly. I mentioned this to Jeff earlier, but a friend of many of us is the new Irish election commissioner. Ireland hasn't had an election commissioner before. But before she did this, she ran the citizens' initiatives and referendums, these really, really ground up conversations that needed to happen in Ireland. And the one that she's particularly close to is the one on gender, because Ireland was such a deeply conservative place, but has changed so much. And that kind of conversational, grounded up way of working is one that she brings with her to this election commissioner role, which is very, very interesting. And being here at the ANU and also with the University of Canberra close by, these are some of the actual world leaders on understanding how citizens' initiatives or these other ways of participating work. So I think there's conversations to be had, but maybe if you could start that conversation now that you've got all these election commissioners in the room. Yeah.
Okay, sure. When I look at citizenship engagement for young people, I'm taking off my AAC hat, so I'm saying this as an individual. Yeah. I think when it comes to government engagement with young people, it's fundamentally flawed. If you look at the engagement strategy that they launched a couple of months ago, one, in terms of reaching out to young people and those who are not active participants, that didn't happen. So the government is not reaching out to disinterested groups. So that's like the first problem. The second problem is one of the engagement strategies, the main one was have young people want to be involved in surveys, online surveys using Instagram and stuff. That's not the case. So you've got this dialogue that is completely mismatched on the ground. And so for me, what I'm sort of seeing is young people, we've got a huge problem when it comes to, as you sort of said, that young men and young women also really don't want to get into a room together that often, because it's actually kind of dangerous for them to, and it's unsafe, it's culturally unsafe. I heard from a young woman today, actually, who's a part of the government advisory groups, that she was told to be quiet and to not share her lived experience. Now, this is on a youth advisory committee. And so we need to fundamentally address that. And I think the other thing is we need to have a more ongoing dialogue around what politicians and what policy looks like for the next generation, for intergeneration. If we're going to build trust, if we're going to encourage young people to actively engage, they need to see policies that reflect the issues that they care about, and they're not really seeing that, and that's why we're pushing further and further away.
Yeah, that leads us, yeah, gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Michael, and then I think we'll go maybe one final round through the panel. So maybe if there's any questions now, we'll do one final round because we need to finish up in 8 minutes. Yeah.
A couple of unrelated observations, and picking up on your point, Therese, about temporary workforces, which Jeff touched on. You can see that as a challenge, and it's an enormous challenge to put it together, but it's also an opportunity in that the people who work for the Electoral Commission can become advocates within the community for the quality of the operation that is being delivered. And the people who go to vote can see that the operation is being run by ordinary people like them, which is something that is completely lost, for example, if you went to 100% internet voting, which was something that was being talked about in some jurisdictions 10 years ago. It seems to have gone very much off the boil now. I've seen this in particular in East Timor, where they have lots of polling officials because of the processes they use, and they are overwhelmingly young. And that's one way of getting people engaged. So that is something to think about. The second issue I wanted to raise is about quality of government, because it's one thing to say that misinformation is diminishing confidence in democracy, but accurate information about the way some governments around the world are behaving would be quite enough also to encourage a lack of confidence in democracy. And you only have to look at the shambles that we've seen in the UK in the last 5 or 10 years and the shambles we've seen in the USA in the last 5 or 10 years to see that there's a challenge there. And there was a point made by Graham Allison in a very recent paper in Foreign Policy where he compared attitudes to governance in Singapore, the UK and the USA. It was very illuminating in terms of the confidence which people had in their governments being competent as distinct from necessarily reflecting democratic views. So I don't think it's enough just to look at what social media is up to. One really needs to, the elephant in the room in this is the way politicians are governing these days compared with the quality of governance which you might have seen 50 or 60 years ago.
I think that's an incredibly good point. To organise good elections and then not to get good governments is disheartening. Any more? I'll have you reflect on Michael's points, but any more before we do our final round? Please go ahead and just wait for the microphone.
Hi, I'm Melissa. I'm from the Australian Media Literacy Alliance. I think it's so fascinating no one's actually used the term media literacy in the conversations that you've had today, including our politicians. This is a big focus in the EU and has been for a number of years. We're at least a decade behind the work that's happening there in Australia. I wonder if we feel that now is the time to implement a national media literacy strategy when we're thinking about social cohesion, when we're thinking about identity, belonging, connecting with young people, connecting with different communities across Australia. Media literacy seems like a really natural way to go, and yet it doesn't seem to be part of the discourse and conversation that anyone is having around elections, democracy, and this sort of thing. Is now the time for a national media literacy strategy in Australia?
Oh, that's an incredibly good point. Anna, the election commissioner from Sweden, and myself are just coming from Sweden right now, and I didn't realise that Australia was behind. So that's.
Can I?
I don't know if that's agreed, but.
Can I jump in?
Yes, and I think we can. Yeah.
Why am I
The
jump
floor is
in?
free. Chaos is fine. Yes.
Totally. It absolutely is. The AEC runs one of the largest digital literacy campaigns, Stop and Consider, which we've been running now for the last 2 federal elections and also the referendum. It's widely recognised. I think 6 out of 10 people recognise the brand and its purpose. And it's been utilised by many of the state and territory electoral commissions in Australia as well, which is fantastic. And we would like to see that grow. And we've also been advocating for a much wider whole of society digital literacy campaign. I think that's a fundamental investment that needs to be made. Just in response, I'm not going to answer Michael's second part of the question because that's about politicians' behaviour and they're a critical stakeholder for election management bodies. But with respect to the temporary election workforce, I completely agree. They are so integral to the process, as are scrutineers here in Australia and party workers. It is a community coming out, delivering the election in front of the community, by the community, for the community, and electors walking in and seeing themselves in the polling place, servicing them and supporting them. It is one of the great features and great assets, and it's sort of the jewel in the crown of Australian elections, and it's one that we need to treasure, and we need to continue to grow. If anyone here would like to be a temporary election worker, please go to our website, but you must be an Australian citizen, so sorry to our friends from overseas.
My son was 18. We were just working on the European Parliament elections, and he was a polling station agent for the polling station worker for the first time when he realised that it was paid, and he told all of his Scout friends. So I think there's going to be a real Scouts polling station connection from now on.
And getting more younger people involved is critical and goes back to some of the other valid points that have been made. It's absolutely the future, and that's what we need to achieve.
A lot of really good themes coming up here: community engagement, media literacy, and culture. If we just do a final round and then we'll close off for today. Justin.
Sure. I'm no longer in the public service. I'm happy to talk about politicians and political class. I'm not sure that I do agree with the view that politicians were better 50, 60 years ago I think that we quickly forget what happened with Nixon. If you have a look at his vice president, we were very close to having an even worse president in power. If you haven't looked at Spiro Agnew, fantastic story. I think politicians have pretty much been the same forever in a day. I don't think that the answer is only lies there. Of course, we should expect a lot from our politicians and more from our politicians, not to say that they should be excused for any intentional errors at all. But I do think that we are, where we should ask more of them is actually to get involved in this marketplace. So you know, we talk a lot about technology. We did make a mistake as governments, so politicians, but also national security communities, economists across the board, in government saying we're not going to get involved in technology because that's going to stifle innovation. The number of technologists that told politicians, just let us be and we will innovate to everyone's benefit, and the politicians fell for it. We're seeing the problem now of not baking in some level of regulation at the beginning of the internet, the beginning of social media. And so for me, that's where we need to go, and why I think social media is more of a problem than the mainstream media, and we need to boost. So to your media literacy, my view is that we have to actually boost, yes, understanding in terms of the population, which does mean being honest about what we're seeing on social media. It means also regulating social media for consistency with mainstream media and to boost trust in other sectors as well. So I think we are at a point in time where we've got to address the technology that we have, the views that we have, and the fact that, unfortunately, in my view, Russia and China and Iran in particular are making hay while we sit back and hope that the technology will get so advanced that one day democracies won't have to do anything and authoritarian regimes won't be able to do anything at their end.
And for our just final moments, regulation engagement, two themes that are coming up now. Where are we landing on trust in our institutions, in our electoral institutions, or however you want to round out this session?
I'm going to try and do the impossible, which is pick up a little thread from what everyone has said and bring it together. And this is my thinking, right? We have had a really rich conversation about so many different challenges. But I think what we should do is recognise that some of the challenges we're talking about are part of the enduring nature of democracy. So lamentations that kids these days aren't engaging in politics, we should always strive to do better. But if you go back to the public policy writings of Walter Lippmann in the early 20th century, kids these days not doing enough in politics, keeping the bastards honest, right? That is one of the things we strive for in democracy, and we must always do better. Mainstream media, there are businesses made in the 19th century, in the 20th century, out of mis and disinformation, fake news in mainstream media. Media literacy as well, constant struggle for democracy. But where I think we should focus, and we may lose a beat if we don't focus, is not just on that nature, that constant struggle, that chaos of democracy, but what is changing in the character of the threats that we face today. And that's where my thinking aligns with Justin's around there is something fundamentally different in the character of the technologies, the speed, the scale, that is different to where we have been before. There is something different in the nature of that authoritarian democracy challenge. And in that sense, I am most interested, and you'd expect this, I'm a national security wonk. I'm most interested in the foreign versus the domestic. I think domestically, elections are ours to screw up. We get it wrong, we fix it. Foreign challenges, much more pernicious, and we may lose a battle and, as Justin said, not be able to walk back from that. And similarly, technologically enabled challenges that move at a pace that might outstrip the antibodies that we've built up as democracies over centuries to respond with, that's where I think some of those challenges are. Not to say any of the others aren't important, they are all significant ongoing struggles, but some of these, I think, go to the top of the poll in terms of where we really need to think about, because if we miss a trick, we might not have the chance to relitigate that again.
working closely with the Ukrainian Election Commission at the moment. I recognize many of the things that you're saying as being very, very true. Dr. Banerjee, do you want to take us out?
Sure. Well, I think what Catherine was saying was super interesting. The temptation to be ahistorical is ever present for us, right? That it's more complicated than it's ever been. It's moving faster than it's ever been. It's all these things are almost certainly not true, as Justin was also saying. So some careful critical thought to what is different and what is the particular nature of that different bit of the challenge, and then how well equipped are we, and this is the bit I guess that I was trying to bring to the conversation, both through conventional and less conventional means. I feel like there's a kind of flexibility and openness that we need to demonstrate, as well as a speed. And that's not to say that it's faster than it's ever been, but it is to say that we need to be timely. And I think it's not to say that it's more complicated than it's ever been, but it is to say it's complicated. And it's not to say that there are, more disciplines or more kind of factors or considerations than it's ever been, but it is to say that it's interdisciplinary and making sure that we both hear voices from different disciplines, but also voices from different demographics, from different communities, and that we are trying to bring that to the solution space. I think that's incredibly important. So it's great to be involved in these sorts of conversations. It always stretches your thinking, and I guess that would be my takeaway.
And that's what ANU does best, conversations across disciplines and in this case, across countries as well. Can I please thank our organisers, our panellists, this gorgeous audience, and the National Security College for a really, really lovely event. Thank you so much.